Hey, nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series on Individualization by Ulrich Beck, who's basically a post structuralist sociologist. And remember, post structuralism is different from postmodernism. Postmodernism isn't necessarily a thing, but it became more of a thing in more recent years. But originally, the post-structuralists who dumbasses like Jordan Peterson label as postmodernists were not postmodernists, and they were not actually even post-structuralists really, because when asked separately, when each asked separately about the terms postmodernism and post-structuralism, both Foucault and Derrida answered, what are those? And they were, of course, the 70s post-structuralist philosophers who disagreed heavily about some subjects, contrary to what dumbasses like Jordan Peterson say, acting like Foucault and Derrida always agreed all the time. They fundamentally disagreed in terms of what deconstruction, post-structuralist deconstruction, can be used for and against, even though they didn't actually use the term post-structural or deconstruction either, but they, like Foucault, used it to basically deconstruct religion and God in a way, and Derrida used it to basically make God seem as what I call indeconstructible, the only thing that cannot be deconstructed, or at least we can deconstruct it and then reconstruct it, unlike the other things that can't be reconstructed after we've deconstructed them. I think it would go something like that. So anyway, we're going to get into post-structuralist sociologist Ulrich Beck's Individualization, which I've gotten into before, which is his book. It's basically about the institutionalization of individualism, and some interesting aspects I've found so far are that this idea of individualism in our like so-called modern Enlightenment culture, that you're a free individual created by God, and you can make all these decisions, and you want to be an individual, but in basically the same way as everyone else, but a more successful version. Like, you want to have a good career, make a lot of money, have a good job, have a car, a family, a house, etc. Maybe you want to get famous and rich. Ooh, really original individuality there, right? So that it's kind of this idea that individualism, like modern Western rationality, democracy, all of these Enlightenment ideas encourage individualism, but they can be ironically collectivist in some ways. All right. So anyway, he's going to talk about this idea of Occidental identity and basically tying it to Occidental rationality, which ties into basically specifically rationality and democracy, and tying that to religion as well, and the way culture has changed with the secularization of culture, with, as we've talked about countless times before, and many others have as well, Nietzsche's so-called death of God, basically just meaning the secularization of culture during the Enlightenment, where theology and God and religion played less of a role in people's societies, and there were less like biblical literalist and fundamentalist views, so to speak, somewhat. All right, so yeah, we'll get into the paragraph here. Okay, so this has its roots, first of all, in the often mentioned alliance between antiquity and the second modernity. For de Tocqueville, so Alexis de Tocqueville, of course, came to America, I think, in the 1700s, wrote the famous book Democracy in America. It's like a seminal work basically for like American paleo conservatives, I would say, about democracy and individualism and how great America is, that sort of thing. Okay, so for de Tocqueville, democracy does not begin with 18th century humanism. Neither is it essentially linked to the political theories of natural law and social contract. So, humanism, so he's saying de Tocqueville is not linking politics to natural law in the social contract in the tradition of someone like Rousseau, which he's going to get to. So, neither is it essentially linked to the political theories of natural law and social contract, which began in the 16th century to displace the church in theology from the center of culture, the secularization of culture, like I talked about, right? The to displace the church and theology from the center of culture, then continued in the metaphysical and scientific systems. So he's using examples of philosophers and scientists here, which is, I think, is really interesting in terms of the idea of integrating religion and politics into the heads of both scientists and philosophers, and this being an aspect of the Enlightenment, even with the secularization of culture, right? Okay, so then continue to the metaphysical and scientific systems of Suarez and Bacon. Francis Bacon, of course, famous English Enlightenment philosopher. Galileo Galilei, of course, extremely famous scientist. Kepler, Johannes Kepler. Forget what exactly he had to do. So he had something to do with the invention of the telescope, I think. Descartes, of course, like the original rationalist that has this, basically believes in this foundation of rationality, has the famous anachronism, I think, therefore I am, which is ultimately logically flawed, especially since comes to the conclusions that he exists and that God exists basically because he thinks, and he entertains the possibility that he could be being deceived about the facts that he think and that God exists. And one of the possibilities that he lays out is that an evil God is deceiving him into believing that he exists and that God exists. But he basically just comes up with a lazy intellectual excuse and says that, well, God wouldn't do that to me because God isn't evil. Therefore, I do exist and God exists. So he has this like logically flawed, basically, philosophy, I would say, which countless philosophers have ruthlessly criticized innumerable times, like John Locke, who we'll get to because he uses him as an example. Okay, so Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Grotius, don't know who that is. Thomas Hobbes, of course, wrote Leviathan. Basically, this idea against democracy, that the idea that there should be this like authoritarian king ruling over society. He was pro-monarchy and kind of against democracy, really. So Spinoza, I've talked about Spinoza before. Of course, a famous philosopher during the Enlightenment who, or actually, I think maybe even preceded the Enlightenment, who talked about this. I could be wrong about that, though, who talked about this idea that we don't need to take the Bible as literally. It doesn't need to be integrated into our lives as much. And even just that sort of thing at the time made him literally strawmanned as something like an atheist, even though the term I don't think was around at the time, but that he didn't believe in God. And even to this day, some philosophers like strawman him as an atheist, especially like traditional conservative religious types too. So, and anyway, so Pascal, of course, famous scientist, and then also philosophers have talked about Pascal's wager, this kind of intellectually lazy argument also, that we should just bet on God and choose to believe that he exists on the off chance that he exists so that we can have a good afterlife. It's basically gambling. And there are way better reasons to believe in God and way more interesting theologies like those I've talked about, including those of people like Richard Rorty and Gianna Vattimo in their book, The Future of Religion. This idea that the Nietzsche's Death of God opened up the door for a religion without a metaphysical God, and you can have like your own personal belief in God that you don't need to justify anything, but you can also still believe in objective scientific data because you separate them, which people have been doing since the Enlightenment anyway, right? Okay, so uh okay, then continued in the metaphysical and scientific systems of Suarez, Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Grotius, Hobbes, Spinoza, Pascal, Leibniz, and Newton. Don't even need to explain who Isaac Newton is, obviously. And finally converged in the 17th and 18th centuries in the birth of the Enlightenment. Rousseau's social contract that I mentioned, and and contractualism, and so the triumphal march of equality then does not begin after religion and the church with the victory of humanism and what Max Weber called Occidental rationality. He's getting at like kind of how this like enlightenment led to rationalism and democracy, but more so, at least so far in this paragraph, rationalism, it led to, like, as Nietzsche kind of predicted too, that people started to kind of worship politics or the philosophy of rationalism a little bit more, because obviously Nietzsche was highly critical of both science and religion, right? So anyway, okay, but it is not only these things. So he's saying, de Tocqueville is saying that rationality and democracy is not only these things, but he's as John, no, wait, not John Caputo, Ulrich Beck is doing here. He's basically laying this out in a way to like criticize it, saying this is what's wrong with this idea, right? Okay, so, but he's still saying this is not de Tocqueville's view, and he's about to get to what his view actually is. But it is not only these things. It has its roots in the Old and the New Testaments, in the sources of Jewish and Christian traditions, and the philosophy of ancient Greece. This is like the whole philosophy of the West, like Judeo-Christianity being the fundamental bedrock of all of Western civilization. Jordan Peterson thing, right? This is de Tocqueville's central message, is the basic theme that has maintained itself through the ages and the contradictions of European intellectual history. Yes, contradictions. It is the spirit of Occidental modernity, Occidental modernity and rationalism, modern rationalist Enlightenment culture, right? Becomes like a fundamentalist, not really a cult centered around Descartes exactly, but like a fundamentalist ideology, not necessarily a religion, but an ideology. Okay. It is the spirit of Occidental modernity in which the origin and the future of Europe are associated with each other. In the demand for equality, a religious, philosophical, metaphysical, humanist, romantic, and rationalist summation of European culture finds both expression and outlet. So he's also talking about equality there, obviously, too, right? And this is within the context of like Enlightenment culture specifically, right? So this idea that secularized, rationalistic Enlightenment culture can allow us to achieve an egalitarian society, kind of almost something like what Rousseau would say, although he was like almost anti civilization in a way, right? But he's laying out that this is Alexis de Tocqueville's view, that the basically like Western religions like Judaism, Christianity, ancient Greek religions, ancient Roman religions, they contributed to the Enlightenment. And even though culture was secularized more, these religions still contributed to Enlightenment rationality, so that modern Enlightenment rationalism combined with these inspirations from ancient religions can allow us to achieve egalitarianism. So Ulrich Beck is laying this out in a critical way as saying that, you know, this is like kind of a really specific intellectual rationalization that devotes you into kind of seeing rationalism as a cult with basically like rationalism as more of a religion, but it's more of this like ideology because it's all of these things, right? Secular Enlightenment rationality, but still inspired by religion. This sort of like basically almost the same sort of ideology that Jordan Peterson practices. Like people have been having this dumb ideology for hundreds of years, and people have been debunking it, and it's stupid. So yes, I think he's not directly criticizing it here, but I think that in the way that Ulrich Beck lays out Alexis de Tocqueville's views here, it's easy to say how they all connect and they just basically form this ideology. You can still like there's nothing wrong with being believing in science. You should believe in science for many things, like vaccines, among many other things, but they can be separate things and they can be institutions that can become ideological depending on the people, right? That happens with religion, science, or any institutions or groups. Right. So yeah, that's how you can say that at least Ulrich Beck is basically implying that this Enlightenment, rationalist, secularized culture is essentially an ideology.